Hello everybody and welcome to the talk. Just FYI, this is not the talk that is on the printed out schedule, roster, whatever. The two talks that I'm giving are switched. I want to give this talk first because I am going to introduce certain concepts in this talk which will be helpful to be aware of when I give the talk tomorrow. So this is about PatternsLip and specifically about a certain development model. I hope that this doesn't happen all the time. Specifically a development model that we've used for Plone intranet and also various other sites. SysLab has been doing quite a few sites like that. Design-driven web development through rich interactive prototypes. This is one use case of PatternsLip. It's not the only way necessarily to use it, but this is what I want to talk about, introduce you to. The slides are online at that web address. So you can load the slides if you want to. They are interactive. So if you want to follow along. So who here has read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Okay, some of the old fogies. This is really a brilliant book. This is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. It's unfortunate that so few people have read it because that means I have to give a bit more of an introduction to it. In the book, I'm not going to talk about the story, but in the book he introduces two ways in which people can approach technology. So in his terminology in the book, he talks about the classic approach and the romantic approach. The classic approach is Aristotelian, in other words, logic-based. It's engineering-driven, it's technical, it's mathematics. The romantic approach is fluid, it's artistic, it's intuitive. You might say it's a little bit more superficial, not necessarily in a negative way, but it's more about how things look. And the classic approach is more about how things work. And in the context of motorcycle maintenance, the author of the book, or the character in the book as well, he has a friend who's more romantic approach. He's a drummer in a band, he's a musician. And he refuses to maintain his motorcycle. He doesn't want to work on his motorcycle because he's intimidated by it, because he sees all these moving parts and he doesn't understand it, and so he just kind of tries to avoid the issue. And all of us have classic and romantic aspects of ourselves, but some people are maybe perhaps more dominant in the classic paradigm or the romantic paradigm. So in web development, you could say the classic paradigm is the developer or the engineer, the guy who writes the code. And the romantic paradigm is represented by the designer or graphic designer, people like that. So just for illustrative purposes, if we look at the logo of Mockup, which is a fork of PatternsLip, my talk tomorrow is going to be about Mockup and PatternsLip and the relationship between the two. But if we look at the logo of Mockup, and this is the header of the old PatternsLip site, because there is really no logo, there's only two things I can compare. This is a cogwheel. A cogwheel is a machine part. This is a technical machine part. Team Mockup is in angle brackets, like HTML markup. And the way the M is drawn and these things are drawn, to me, it represents a technical drawing. And it's a technical machine part to represent it, and this technical markup language for the name. So this thing to me looks classical. The mindset behind it, the person who came up with this has a much more classical approach. least to my sensibilities. Classical in the sense of how the word is used in Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. If you look at the PatternsLip one, firstly, there's two fashionable ladies in it. There's stuff like Vogue. There's these graphics here that evoke the idea of cutout patterns for making fashion, for making garments. And it's all about fashion and art and design and style. I mean, the imagery that the two things convey couldn't be more different. And yet they are kind of supposedly the same thing. The one is a fork of the other. But it clearly shows the intent behind it, or the approach of the people who created it. So I'm going to talk about PatternsLip, the above one, and you can totally see that this project was started by a designer, and the designer's footprints are all over it, or fingerprints, I guess. And even though there are these two paradigms, PatternsLip and that the design-driven approach comes from the romantic paradigm, the idea of PatternsLip is to bring the two together. If we think of the guy in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance who is too scared to work on his motorcycle, a designer is also too scared to write JavaScript. Designer doesn't want to peek under the hood and write code. That's not what they signed up for. They didn't become a designer to do that. They want to be creative, they want to create stuff, and they want to make things pretty and usable. So PatternsLip aims to abstract away all the scary parts for a designer so that they can still create very functional, usable prototypes, but without having to worry about the stuff under the hood. They don't have to maintain their own motorcycle. So just to reiterate, design-driven development through the use of prototypes. So why do designers like to use prototypes? And why is it a good idea to do a prototype-based approach to web development? Big part of it is just that design is not about how things look. Design is also about how things work. In web development or web design, we talk about UX and UI, user interface and user experience. But these are kind of two sides of the same coin. If something is well designed, it's also easy to use and intuitive. So prototypes, when you're making a prototype, you're building to think. You are learning by failing, by trying out things and seeing what works and that doesn't work. You figure out quickly what needs to be done. And you have permission to try new things out because you are not working on an existing project that is already out in the wild that people are using on. You're working on something new. So that's the value of prototypes. Why first making a prototype? Well, you can communicate the designer's vision to the rest of the team and to the client. You can test assumptions before you start writing code and fixing things, like making a fixed system. You can try things out first. You can get initial user testing and feedback on the prototype. If the prototype is interactive and clickable and you can use it to a large degree, then you can do user testing with it before you've written a single line of Python code or JavaScript or anything. You can solve design problems. Often with complex systems, you don't know what's going to be the issues until you've started working on it. And the developers can see the context within which their work will be exposed to the end user. Developers are often in a abstract world of algorithms and code and problems and things to solve, and not necessarily always aware how is someone going to interact with the stuff that I'm working on. To be able to see the end product can also be very, very instructive and helpful for the developer. And then, of course, a prototype allows you to make a demonstration. And if you make a demonstration of a very slick prototype to a client, you can potentially much easier, it might be potentially much easier to land a product, land a sale, sorry. So PatternsLip. What is PatternsLip? PatternsLip is a toolkit and a library which allows designers to create rich interactive prototypes in HTML and CSS without having to learn or write any JavaScript. From a designer's perspective, you pick and choose individual patterns, and you use these patterns to add functionality and interactivity to your prototype. You can get more complex behaviors by combining different patterns. A developer's perspective is kind of from the other side. For a developer, PatternsLip allows you to write, encapsulate, almost like package, and then expose front-end JavaScript in such a way that it comes naturally to designers. It's again about this idea, you want to hide complexity from the designer. You don't want the designer to think about the JavaScript. You don't want him to think about the implementation. You just want to make available the functionality in a way that to the designer is intuitive. So what can individual patterns do? This is the simplest pattern that exists. It's called PatToggle. And you have a trigger element, which is the button in this case. And when you click the trigger element, the class gets toggled. And in this case, the class has a color assigned to it. So how it works is you invoke the pattern on the trigger element by setting a special class, PatToggle. And you configure the pattern through a data attribute. It's always data dash and the name of the pattern, so data PatToggle. You're saying the selector, what is the thing I'm toggling? That's that span element, because it has the ID to toggle. And you're saying, I want to change the value from red to blue. It should actually be orange because it's more like orange, but anyway. Misnamed class name. And the store session is just to say to store it in session storage. So if you reload the page, it stays the way you toggled it. Another one is, oh, you know what? I'm using the wrong, well, just reload. Yeah, now it's stored in session storage. I'm using, well, I'll just stick here now. That one was, I've already used, I went through this whole thing to kind of test that everything works, and now the thing's already set. That was originally green, but I clicked the button to turn it blue. So I turned it blue, and there I can turn it green. And same principle, pat switch is the name of the pattern, and you can switch certain attributes. Here's another one, you can make tabs. This is a pattern called pat stacks. And again, the principle is just that you add special markup pat stacks there, class pat stacks. You don't even have to configure this pattern in this case. There's certain conventions. If you follow the convention, it just works. But of course, you can configure it the way you want to. And as you can see, there's no JavaScript involved. I mean, it's not possible to do something like this without JavaScript, but this is exposed to you in a way that you don't have to use JavaScript. Here's one that we made for a client recently. You can clone elements. Let's say you have a form where you want to add a list of family members, and people have families of varying sizes, so you don't know how big someone's family is. So you can add extra family members. You can remove them. And yeah, that's the pattern. It's also relatively clever. It knows the number of the family member, and there's little tricks like that where it will always automatically increment attributes and IDs and stuff like that. There's the markup for it. I'm not going to go too much into the markup because we don't have that much time. Suffice to say that, again, you have PatClone, that's the name of the pattern. You configure it, you tell it there's a template that you want to clone. That's this thing, it's hidden. But you clone it, so every time you press the button, it makes a clone of that thing and injects it or inserts it. Ajax, or what we call injection in patterns is one of the biggest one, or one that we use the most. If I click on that button, it will fetch through XML HTTP request some external content and put it inside this div. There I have sorry, it's not a button, it's a link that's meant to look like a button. It has class patternJect, and it has an href. So the patternJect pattern will look at the href attribute, and it will, because there you have the hash demo content, it will look for the demo content anchor inside that page that is fetched and insert it inside demo content in our current page. So this is again also convention, but you can configure it differently if you want to. So if I click there, it gets injected, and patterns that get injected still work. So also, if you didn't have JavaScript enabled, this would all still just work. You would just click on that, and it would just reload the page and load that page. Other examples, you can have a Twitter feed, RSS, modal dialogues, rich text editing, form validation, automatic form submission, auto-tagging, slideshows, galleries, lots more. So as a developer, how does this apply to me? How can I make patterns, or how can I write JavaScript that is exposed in this way? This is basically the boilerplate for a pattern. This whole top section here is UMD, Universal Module Declaration for JavaScript. This is like standard boilerplate if you have JavaScript that you want it to support required.js or common, what's the other one, common.js, various different module loaders and so on. You basically always have to have this. If define is there, which comes from required.js and similar module loaders, then you come in here and you declare your dependencies. Otherwise, the dependencies have to be available globally. Then it comes into this module here, and we have a base pattern. That's pat_base, and we extend it. This is very similar to Backbone. I don't know who knows Backbone.js, but Backbone, you also extend Backbone.model or Backbone.view, and then it's like instantiating. Actually, it's not yet instantiating. You instantiate with a new operator, but this is creating a new class. Well, not overriding, extending, but yeah, kind of. You give the name, and you give a trigger. So this example here, I named it cycle and pat cycle. This is a pattern I actually created to cycle through quotes on my wife's website. And you have an init function that will get called when the pattern gets loaded. So that's the boilerplate. As I say, this whole section here is standard JavaScript. This is absolutely nothing special about patterns. This you will have in almost all JavaScript modules. And this is just like base.extend, which is a very common way of doing things. Now, inside the init method, here's the custom code. Just to show, there's the markup. I have a div with a bunch of block quote elements, 1, 2, 3 quotes. The first quote is visible, the second 2 quotes are hidden. In the code, I find all block quotes. I take a random one and I show it. Then, after 8 seconds, I get the next one. If we are at the last one, it gets the first one again, so it wraps around. I fade out the existing shown one and I fade in the new one. So I'm cycling through quotes. So it will always cycle through these 3 quotes, starting at a random one. And there, that's it. That's the pattern. I'd made a little bit less than 8 seconds, something like 4 or 5 seconds. It's always nerve-wracking when it doesn't switch quickly enough for me. I've made a generator. I don't know if anybody's used Yeoman. Yeoman is like a JavaScript generator, similar to Paster or Mr. Bob or Zoapscal, those kind of things. you can generate boilerplate to get you started. So if you install generator PatternsLip through npm, you create your directory and you go into it and you say, yo, PatternsLip pat example, the name of the pattern. It will generate all the boilerplate. Basically what I shown earlier, well, I'm not going to go back to that now, it's a little bit further back, but all that boilerplate I showed, it will generate that. It will generate the Bower JSON, it will generate the package.json, it will generate a README, all kinds of stuff. Everything you need to get started. So what are the advantages of using patterns? They're highly reusable. It's sustainable development, you could say. You create patterns and you can use them in all kinds of different sites. You're not writing code for this client and then not reusing it, or if you ever reuse it, you copy paste. No, it's made to be reusable. They're composable. You can use patterns, you can compose them in different ways, use them in different relations with one another to create even more complex behaviors. They're customizable, they can be configured. They allow for graceful degradation. Like I mentioned, PatternJect, it uses standard HTML markup on the anchor tag. So if JavaScript's not available, it will just load that file. I've often seen this in JavaScript. If JavaScript's not enabled, then yeah, it's not going to work. I know it's not so popular anymore to think that some people might want to browse the web without JavaScript enabled, but I block JavaScript by default. And many websites have maybe 5, 6, 7 ad tech tracker stuff enabled. It's just to track you wherever you go, see what you're doing. I don't like that, so I block it. And I'm always impressed with sites that work fine without JavaScript enabled. And I'm always a little bit, what's the opposite of impressed? Disappointed with sites that don't. The core code base is easy to understand. There's really not a lot of code. It's readable. So when not to use patterns? Well, single-page apps might be a case where you shouldn't use patterns, although that's also debatable. But there are cases where you want to do something with AngularJS or React or something like that, single-page app. You could still encapsulate that in a pattern. In other words, you could still expose that to a web designer, that they initiate it through writing a pattern in their HTML, but you might not want to do everything, or all the individual subcomponents as patterns. Another way of not using patterns is there's no point in making sub-modules that are not exposed to a designer patterns, because the whole point of patterns is this way of exposing it to someone to be used and abstracting away the complexity. If that's not the goal, if you just want to make some kind of library or something that's usable in other code and your audience or your consumer is other developers, not designers, then you don't need to use patterns. And then just want to do a quick run through comparing it with other frameworks. The fundamental thing to be aware of is that PatternsLip has a primary user, it has a consumer, and that is not other JavaScript developers, that is designers. And this is something that sets PatternsLip apart from many other frameworks or many other ways of doing web development. And the important part also is that the way you expose it in such a way to shield or to just let the designer not have to worry about JavaScript. So Backbone, like I said earlier, this base.extend, that's very similar. It's the same way that Backbone does it, where you extend a Backbone model or a Backbone view. You could easily use Backbone inside a pattern. There's no reason why not to do that. They're completely compatible with one another. Angular has like a relatively similar concept in the sense of the ng directives. A little bit like Tau also, like you can say ng repeat or ng, I don't even remember everything, ng this, ng that. Some of it's a bit like TAL, like you can repeat certain sections, or you can make some things conditional on some kind of variable and so on. But Angular is not, it doesn't have this, this approach of making this dead easy and simple for designers to use. Generally speaking, you will always still write code when you're doing Angular. And so it has a different, it has a different way, it still has kind of like the other paradigm of that your consumer is other developers. You could write something like PatternsLip in Angular, you could do that, but that's not the same as saying Angular is directly a competitor to PatternsLip. In a way it is, but in another way, because it has a different paradigm, not really. Concerning React, I'm not aware of any reason why React views or using React could not be compatible with the patterns approach of doing things. I haven't done it, but in other words, what I'm saying is the PatternsLip approach is still compatible for a large, in a large part with these other frameworks. Angular, I'm not so sure because it's very much a kitchen sink approach. Lastly, web components. Web components is a standard, well, I'll read this. It's a standardized, non-obtrusive way to write encapsulated functionality in the form of a component. Each component can hold its own HTML, markup, styles, and JavaScript code, without the risk of breaking things around it. Sounds a bit similar to patterns. You have these reusable components. However, it's not supported in all browsers, i.e., I think almost all the versions of IE don't support it. Safari doesn't support it. There are advantages to it. It's a W3C standard. They have this idea of a shadow DOM, where the component can modify its own DOM, but not stuff outside of it. It's also conceivable to have a PatternsLip of web components or to integrate web components into PatternsLip. But again, it's not completely the same because I think the idea of web components is you add a little special tag or element and then suddenly some complex widget appears, gets kind of inserted in there. And PatternsLip is not really the same thing for the most part. PatternsLip is more like enhancing existing markup that's already there. So why is PatternsLip a good fit for a CMS? I'll speak a little bit more about Plone specifically tomorrow because then I'm also talking about mockup. But in a more general sense, it allows progressive enhancement. So you can have an existing site. This is not really just about CMS, it's anything actually. But you can have an existing site and you drop in your PatternsLip JavaScript file, which is a bundle of patterns. And then you can start adding this special markup just here and there in the site if you want to do something. If you want to have a sidebar that opens and closes when you press a button, or if you want to have tabs, or if you want to have a Twitter feed, there's a pattern for that. You just say pat Twitter and you give it the Twitter ID or something like that, and then it loads the tweets. It can also be added to older sites. Kind of fits to the previous point. This concept of injection works with existing pages. So you could have a site that's, let's say, an old site without Ajax, or that it just loads in the old sense of every page loads by itself, which is like Plone 3.5 or I don't know, even Plone 4. And you could start adding pat inject there, and suddenly you load these things through Ajax, so you only refresh a certain part of the page. And it also exposes the power of JavaScript functionality to non-technical or non-JavaScript people. So it's not only about designers. You could also have an integrator or an administrator of a Plone site who wants to extend a certain portlet to do something there, to add some functionality or somewhere else on the page. Oh, that's it. Yeah, that's my talk. Any questions?
Who are the biggest users of patterns that you know about?
Plone, well, Plone intranet uses patterns, and Syslab uses patterns for the last 4 or 5 large sites they've made. There's a Dutch design company called Informat that's using patterns. I know Wichert Ackermann made a few pyramid sites which use patterns. Alex said something about people in Brazil using it. But to be honest, I don't know everybody or all the people. Sometimes we get issues in the GitHub tracker from someone that nobody knows. Someone just pops up and they're like, oh, I'm using this and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah.
Just to get my understanding right, so you'd use it in Diazo theme rather than installing a Plone package?
Yeah, exactly. Diazo is kind of like so perfect for patterns. Before Diazo came about, it was really difficult to style Plone. And with Diazo, the idea is that you create this theme, right, with static HTML and CSS, and then you kind of layer it on top of your Plone site. So besides just creating a theme with static HTML and CSS, you can now also make that theme an interactive prototype. This is kind of the point of an interactive prototype. It's basically a theme, but it's clickable, and you can do things with it. Just an example, maybe not everybody's seen this. This is the prototype for Plone intranet. So this uses patterns. This is static HTML, CSS. There's no backend. There's nothing behind it. But it looks like it. If you do things like you want to share it with certain people, you can do things like there, and these names appear. I'm inadvertently clicked now on the lady, but you know, this looks like a fully functional website, right? So you can demo this to people and say, this is what the site's going to look like, this is what this section is going to look like, this is how this thing is going to behave. But this is static, and this uses patterns. And you can take this and put it on top of a Plone site with Diazo.
So when Plone intranet talk about design first, do you think this was something that really helped them?
Totally, it's this. This is the design first. You design an interactive clickable prototype, and you often sell the whole concept through that, and you get people to understand what is the vision of the product, and then later you create the backend functionality and you kind of layer this on top with Diazo. I think John.
So I know a challenge for designers is often how to communicate their design to the developers, to the implementers, and they spend a lot of time doing wireframes and basically mock-ups of the design. And with this, it becomes their tool to document and explain their design, to sell their design to the developer.
Yeah, this is also the canonical document or specification of the UI. If something is not in the prototype, then it's not yet worked out, fleshed out, or yeah, it's not yet there, it doesn't exist. So if someone kind of goes off on a tangent, some developer, and adds his own stuff and doesn't put it into the prototype, or it doesn't first go through the design phase, then it breaks the rules in a way. And of course, this whole approach presupposes that the designer can do this, right? It's not every designer that can write HTML and CSS. It's becoming much more common nowadays, but you do have still designers who only do Photoshop and Illustrator and then expect someone else to create it. Maybe you could have that kind of workflow, and then you still have, let's say, a front-end developer who creates the prototype. So I don't want people to kind of get stuck on the designer label also. It's just the point is you have someone making an interactive prototype. In the case of Plone intranet and with Syslab also, it is a designer. And more often than not, I think it might be a designer. And this whole approach kind of fits exactly to what release manager, what's his name? Eric Steele said about David Bain and Annette Lewis, who are two people. I don't know if David Bain, if he is a designer or if he has designers working for him, but the point there was that Diazo makes it easy to style or skin Plone sites, right? That's true, and PatternsLip makes it easy to make clickable prototypes out of these designs.
I just want to, don't ask a question, just add one more point from a designer's point of view. What I really like with patterns is that these names have proper semantic markup as well, so you get an idea what's going on just by looking at the code.
Yeah.
So it makes easier even for designers who are experienced with other kind of code to do a quick prototype. Don't get stuck during the creation process.
Yeah, it's semantic, it's declarative, and it's also meant to look like CSS. So it's meant to be the lowest common denominator between developers and designers. In other words, the designer knows how to do CSS, that's the assumption at least. And so you expose the configuration of the pattern in something that the designer understands, which is CSS, and which the developer should most likely also understand. I guess my time is up. I just wanted to also show this page. I loved the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance so much, I wrote a review about it. And kind of it almost changed, I would say, well, I don't know, I guess it changed my life. The other two links there are just inspiration. It was that I used for making this talk. Graphics by Cornelis Kolbach. He's also the guy who makes the prototypes for SysLab and who made the Plone Intranet prototype. And on PatternsLip.com, that's the patterns website, you can download patterns there and stick it into your website. It's very easy. You don't have to muck around with any JavaScript tools or so. Thanks very much.